coming along, and thank you again, incidentally, for briefing us before Christmas. It's appreciated. So I'll start the questioning. There are two aspects to our hearing this morning. We're hearing from the Minister later on, particularly on the non-appearance of the biometrics strategy. But we also wanted to talk to you about developments since the government published the forensic strategy. How do you see the position on the forensic strategy now, some 2 years after it was published? And there was a thought at the time that a lot of things were incomplete and unclear. How do you assess things now? Are they better now?
No, I don't think they are better now. I think we've seen over the last couple of years some of the risks that were raised at the time crystallise. So we've seen two smaller companies and now one large company offering forensic services to the police in the UK go out of business. So, the third one just very recently has gone into administration, and we don't know yet whether a buyer will be found or whether it will be wound down. So I think...
So you have the real concerns about the sustainability of the market, do you?
Absolutely, yes. I think something different has to happen if we're going to ensure continuity of supply, and particularly enough expertise remaining within the field, because a number of people have been made redundant once, a number have been made redundant twice, and you can't really keep continuing to make people redundant time and time again and expect that they'll stay and retain their expertise in the CJS.
And presumably getting this sorted out is critically important, is it, for the administration of justice?
Yes, it is.
And to what extent are forensic companies bidding too low for police contracts? Is that part of the problem, that they then can't sustain the contract once they've won it?
It does seem that the way some of the contracts are procured tends to push towards lowest pricing. Now, it's not the case in all of the contracts, but in some of the contracts. I did go and talk to the forensic service providers at their group, the Association of Forensic Science Providers, and said, why are you bidding just quite so low on these contracts? And their response was, well, if the contract award is more than 50% of the evaluation criteria is based on price, then if, no matter how good we are in all other areas, we can't win unless we're low priced. Now, I don't believe that's the case for all of that particular contract that we're talking about, but certainly for some lots that was the case. And some of the other contracts had a lower amount on price, but it is a very important part of the tendering process, and it seems at the minute that although each particular contract might be acting in what appears to be the best interests of the force or forces involved, and does certainly bring about large savings for them, if you look at the picture overall, then the constant downward pressure on price has brought things to a point where, we've seen, as I say, the third largest provider go into administration. Now, I don't know the details of all the reasons why they went into administration, but clearly the impacts could be very substantial, and we think about investment in science, investment in research, investment in training and continuous professional development, retention of staff, and all those issues come to the fore.
And as I understand it, with the company that went bust last week, there was a big bailout from the police to keep the service running for a period of time. Do you think that the police, there's an issue about the quality of police procurement, that they're not weighing bids, tenders effectively enough, and putting too much focus on cost saving rather than the sustainability of the contract?
I think if you take an overall picture, I think you would have to come to that conclusion. I think some individual contracts have taken into account sustainability and so on. But when you look at the picture across the board, I don't think it has done enough to make sure that there is stability in the marketplace. And obviously when the strategy was published a couple of years ago, it talked about national approaches and so on. And there has been a programme set up within policing, the Transforming Police Forensics, but it's only now at the business case stage. So there's been uncertainty for another couple of years, and there's still uncertainty, I'd say, amongst the providers as to what that will mean for them.
To what extent do all of the problems link back, if at all, to the abolition of the Forensic Science Service back in 2012?
In my opinion, it's a very similar set of circumstances that led to that closure that has carried on. So in many ways, the closure of the FSS is not the cause of the problems. It was a symptom of similar problems that were existing at that point in time.
And is there an issue that companies are bidding low in order to beat in-house bids, as it were, and when the police haven't had to get their own labs accredited in the same way as the private sector providers have?
I think by the time it comes to the procurement and bidding process, I don't see that as a factor, because generally police will only put services out for contract that they don't want to take in-house. So I don't think it's so much a factor at that point. In fact, I believe that one police insourcing activity was cancelled after the last round of tenders because they realised there's no way that they could deliver it themselves as cheaply as the providers had bid.
Right. So you tend not to get competition on a particular tender between in-house and outside?
No, it tends to be a decision is made, what are we going to outsource, and then that will be tendered for. Right.
Graham, do you want to come in?
Yeah, Norman's question the other way round about the abolition of the FSS. When you've been before the committee previously, you've said that the abolition of the FSS would lead to murderers and rapists getting away with crime. Is that still your view, and is there any evidence that has happened?
I think we've talked previously about the precise wording of what I said. I think there is a risk, particularly at the commissioning stage for forensic science. So if, in the first place, a crime is not detected, and if the evidence is not secured at an early stage, then we certainly have seen, particularly in a number of potential suspected homicides, that they weren't even recognised to be homicides in the first instance, so therefore evidence wasn't preserved and wasn't sent off for forensic examination. Now, that's nothing to do with the FSS or closure of the FSS, but it is a significant issue if we're looking to see how can we make best use of forensic science in the criminal justice system. And there was recently, obviously, a great deal of public comment about the failure to preserve evidence, for example, after the death of Poppy Worthington, and there have been other cases of that sort. In terms of wider commissioning, I think the issue is how well is forensic science commissioned in any particular case, and I think in some cases it's commissioned very well and answers the questions that the criminal justice system needs to know the answers to, but I don't think that is routine. And so another example, and this has recently been brought to my attention again by journalists, in fact, is that despite me issuing very clear guidance in 2016 about the need for forensic medical examination to be carried out by different doctors when you're looking at the suspect and victim of an alleged offence, that there are still some parts of the country where doctors are being asked to see a victim and a complainant in the same case, and that's entirely inappropriate because of anti-contamination measures, and so could potentially lead to a miscarriage of justice.
When we discussed the ending of the FSS, it wasn't just the commissioning that you identified as a problem, it was the context of the evidence. Do you now have experience where there hasn't been the contextual analysis and the dialogue between the scientists and the police that has led to a less effective outcome than one might have expected with the FSS?
Well, I think, again, I would say that and I think we had this discussion before, I think there was actually some of that problem still happening when the FSS was around. I think the problem has got worse, not because of the other providers, but because of this issue of what they're being asked to do. So if they're only asked to look at this little sample in a tube and tell me what the DNA profile is, that's where you lose the context. Whereas if someone's being asked to talk about that evidence in the context of the case and where it might have come from and how it might have got there, then that's where you get much better value from your forensic science in court. So it's not that people can't do it, it's that it's not necessarily always being asked for.
Thanks. And that's very clear. The other problem that you identified in your previous appearances before the committee was not about the most recent crimes, but about the archive of evidence from previous crimes, what are now cold cases, I suppose. What is the state that the archive's in at the moment?
I don't have a great deal of interaction with the archive, but as I understand it, the archive is static, and then it will over time decrease as the time limit for storing cases expires. Now, although that was the outcome of the recent review into the archive, and it was a decision that it wouldn't take material from other providers, I believe that when Forensic Telecommunications Systems, when its insolvency was discovered, that there was an agreement that for the archive to take some of that material in-house, because at that point there were computer hard disks and all sorts not secured in any particular appropriate location, so the archive did take those in, at least on a temporary basis. But I think that is a particular concern, is what happens when an organisation goes out of business and where does the material go?
Thank you.
But just to be clear on this, I mean, you say it's of critical importance to get this sorted out. I mean, the consequences potentially of not getting it sorted out is presumably potentially very serious miscarriages of justice, people being convicted wrongly, but also on the other hand, people potentially not being convicted who've committed very serious offences.
Can I just check, sorry, Chair, which...
well, just generally the state of the market and the fragility of the market and the extent to which, when companies go out of business, what happens to everything that they hold and so forth. Not having a proper regime in place runs the risk of these things, serious consequences in the criminal justice system.
Yes.
Thank you. Just one other quick question. With regard to the criminal investigation currently underway, do we have any update on the number of potential criminal cases where there have been outcomes which are now in doubt?
Are you referring to the toxicology issues?
Yes.
No, I don't have a consolidated set of figures on the difference in outcomes. What I can say is that for a number of cases where originally the breakdown products of cannabis were present in a blood sample in the original test, there have been a number of cases in which those are now below the legal limit. Now, I can't say, sitting here, whether that is because they were always below the legal limit or because those particular samples have degraded over time. The breakdown products of cannabis do degrade very quickly over time. So there will be criminal justice implications of that. But whether there was originally a miscarriage of justice or not is impossible to say. Right.
But that will inevitably result in those cases having to be reviewed, presumably.
Yes.
Scientific evidence on how quickly that breaks down?
Not in such a way as you could back calculate from there. So yes, there are too many factors that influence how quickly the products break down to enable you to work backwards.
But when you go back and whether it was below the legal limit at the time it was first analysed or whether it's degraded, presumably if it's now below, the conviction isn't safe.
Well, if it's going back to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, if it's a closed case, they will have to consider issues of whether the original conviction was safe or not, and they will consider issues like degradation and like the fact that there were 2 samples and the second one could have been analysed and wasn't, and what the plea was, and they will take into consideration all of those issues.
Okay,
but it's certainly cast aside.
Thank you. Carol?
Thank you, Chair. You'll have to excuse me, I've been somewhat blinded here. Dr. Tully, you've set deadlines for forensic providers to meet, to be accredited and to meet certain standards. What sort of progress has been made on this, and is there a difference between police and commercial labs?
Yes, I divide the market into 3 to talk about progress against standards. So the first is the large commercial providers, and I'd say they're extremely compliant with the standards and have been for many years. The second is policing, and there has been an acceptance in principle by policing that they will move towards meeting the standards. However, they are running very substantially behind where they need to be. So on digital forensics, many organisations failed to meet the October deadline. So of about 46 legal entities in policing, only I believe around 17 had any sort of accreditation by the time the deadline passed, and most of those it wasn't the full scope that was required. There's a deadline coming up in 2018 for fingerprint comparison, and that's a very important deadline. And whilst the original prediction, the last prediction from policing was that 20 would meet that 3 might miss it and 4 would miss it. But our current assessment of that, based on progress so far, is that only 13 potentially will meet the target. 4 may miss it, and 10 almost inevitably will miss that deadline in October this year.
So that's for the fingerprint.
That's for
comparisons.
Fingerprint comparison.
That's quite specific numbers you're giving us there.
Yes.
And obviously those that are going to miss it will have to put some actions in place in order to come up to standards. Do you see that happening?
Nationally, the NPCC has a forensic portfolio that does try to address these issues, and we do work very constructively together. They have a performance and standards group led by ACC Lewis from Dorset Police, and we are meeting later this month to see what we can do together to try and alter that trajectory. But at this point in time, it's very difficult to alter that trajectory for October this year, because there is only so much time left and there's an awful lot left to do, and I think that it is inevitable that some forces will still miss that. What we might have a chance of doing, if policing can do something radically different, is to try and avert missing the 2020 deadlines around crime scene, collision investigation and fire investigation.
Can I ask you specifically about the digital forensics? The labs that did miss the deadlines, did they have a good reason for missing them? And have they made any progress in these 3 months? If you're now talking 2020, it sounds as though they possibly haven't.
No, the 2020 deadline is for a different set of activities.
Okay.
The 2017 deadline hasn't changed, and all those organisations who are not compliant now have a duty to disclose that non-compliance in any statements they make to the court under the criminal procedure rules. So,
and do you think that will encourage them to?
I very much hope so,
compliant?
yes. It's not that they haven't made any progress, and I don't underestimate the challenge that this has been, because digital forensics has grown massively. It's the only area of forensic science that is growing, really, and it's grown massively over the last few years, and the volumes of data have grown massively. And policing has been trying to keep pace with those developments at the same time as work from a very low starting position in terms of adopting standards. So the process of what I would call validation, which is making sure that your methods are fit for purpose, that they do what you think they do and they do what you say they do, and you know what their limitations are, has been a very, very steep learning curve in the digital forensics community. It's not something that they have engaged in before. But as you can anticipate, it's extremely important because a court needs to know what the limitations of a method are. They need to know whether certain types of file might not have been found when a mobile phone was downloaded and so on. So,
do you think this will change the outcome of court cases, this non-compliance?
What I've asked all non-compliant organisations to do is state whether they are compliant or not, and if they're not compliant, to provide an annex that tells the court what mitigation they have in place that will enable the court to decide whether or not their evidence is sufficiently reliable to be used as expert evidence in particular. And that would include, have they done this validation process? Have they shown their methods work? Are their staff demonstrably competent? So have they undertaken competence tests to make sure they're competent? Have they got appropriately calibrated equipment and so on? So if organisations are well along the way to achieving the standards, then they will be able to provide appropriate mitigation and the court can test that appropriately. For organisations that have made very little or no progress, then they haven't got that mitigation to provide to the court.
Is that leading to some just deciding to put it out to tender instead?
Well, the problem is that in the commercial sector, progress has also been very slow. So I said, all the large providers are very compliant, but the digital forensic providers, a lot of them are smaller. Now, there are 4 organisations in the commercial sector that have got accreditation as required. And many of the other providers are actually 1- and 2-person providers, just working from home and using tools that, again, they may not have validated. So I think that sector of the market is the most non-compliant of all, because it has actually, I do get people saying to me when I speak at conferences, well, what are you going to do if we're not compliant? You haven't got any power to make us stop. And so I think that's the most concerning sector, because there's a continuing effort by the MPC's forensic portfolio, their digital portfolio, to try and help police forces to get there. But in this very small business sector, there's very little movement. And the providers, the 4 providers, commercial providers who are compliant, they have a very fair complaint that some of the contracts that have been awarded that went past the deadline, the delivery of those contracts went past the deadline, didn't do enough due diligence to say whether those providers would be compliant in time for the deadlines. So they missed out on those contracts to cheaper providers who were not investing in the quality standards.
Can I ask you a final question just about the cost of compliance? Because I think your annual report quotes it can range from about 7,000 to 17,000 to get accreditation. Now, to me that doesn't seem like an awful lot for a large company, but is it for some of these smaller providers you're talking about? Is that enough to put them off?
So those figures were just looking at accreditation to my codes of practice and conduct. So organisations need to be accredited to the international standards for each discipline that they work in, and then there's also a requirement for compliance to my codes of practice and conduct. So the total bill will be higher than those figures. The difference between the two was how ready the organisation was to be accredited. So the £7,000 was an organisation that was ready, that had the accreditation body come in, check that they were ready and say, yes, good, off you go, with a few actions. And the 17,000 was one that came in and they were so far off being ready that they had to have additional visits and lots of extra work to fill in all the gaps.
This would be an annual fee, though, would it?
Now, that particular fee, accreditation runs on a 4-year cycle, and that's the first year. The first year is always the most expensive because that's when accreditation is first granted. If you look overall, the sort of figure that the large commercial providers who have had accreditation for many years would say, they reckon it's about a 15 to 20% overhead having the amount of accreditation that's required. It is substantial, but in my view, it's critically important. I am concerned that obviously for a very small provider, especially a 1-person provider, the costs are proportionately higher. But it's very difficult to see how I could fairly set a different standard for those people, because they're still providing evidence to the criminal justice system. So the Chartered Society of Forensic Sciences are working with the accreditation body and myself to try and work out if there's a way that we can help small providers to work together to minimise the costs but still achieve the same standard. But again, it all takes time.
Okay, thank you, and I'll come with a baseball cap next week.
Thank you. Design issue you've identified there. Okay, Bill. Thank you.
Gillian, good morning. Your annual report advises that the accreditation visits carried out by UCAS, the accreditation service, found over 700 anomalies, and a layperson, 700 seems a large figure. Was it a batch failure? How would you explain the 700? And is it something you worry about? And what were the main problems that you found in the audits of the accreditation?
So, no, those were not failures like a batch failure. Those were failures to meet the standard in various ways, and some of them were larger and some of them are smaller. If we look at the specifics, there were actually, from 23 visits, 733 findings, of which 694 were mandatory and only 39 were just recommendations. So those would range from small to large non-compliances. The main regions were control of data, business continuity, and validation of methods, which I just spoke about. So some examples really in terms of control of data, computer backups not being stored at a separate and secure location, so that if there was a fire or anything of that nature, the information wouldn't be retrievable. A shared login on a computer where analytical data is stored, which is just entirely unacceptable that multiple people can log on under the same username.
Would you describe that as a standard failure?
It's not it's not something I would expect to find, given that these standards have been published since 2011, but it is something that was found, and this is the sort of thing that gives the justification for having that rather expensive accreditation step at the end, because if it's not there, people don't comply. If no one's coming in to check if they're compliant, it's quite clear that they just don't. There was a digital forensics unit operating its own network outside of the main police force IT area, so the management of its electronic information wasn't fully documented and didn't follow force security procedures. There were business continuity plans with actions open and no owner assigned to them, and as we've seen with organisations going out of business, having a proper business continuity plan is absolutely critical.
These cover both the in-house and the
yes, this is across the board. And there was, for example, in terms of validation, one of the requirements is that there's a library of all the information that you're relying on to show the reliability of your methods.
That's part of the audit.
Yes, and there was a validation library reference, but the actual papers weren't available for anyone to see at the laboratory. So, how can a scientist rely on something if they don't have access to it? And things like, backdoors of laboratories can be accessed by anyone with swipe card access, whereas there's a whole detailed swipe control system on the front that only lets certain people in. So, it's some of them are, oversights. But until you have that sort of detailed assessment, you don't pick up these oversights and make sure that they're completely covered.
So premise security, data security, and the ability to recover data in the event of an unplanned incident such as a fire or flood.
Those were some of the actions. There were also things like no documented policy to ensure that exhibits or parts of exhibits are preserved for subsequent defence examination. Quality manual referring to all staff having undergone security vetting, but no detail as to how that was happening. Organisations, people not actually understanding or knowing about their own organisation's code of conduct. So there was a real range of those sorts of things.
And some quite serious.
Yes, absolutely. Master copy finger mark images that could be altered without any audit trail. All sorts of things that really should not be happening.
So great scope for rogues if they get into one of those organisations to do mischief.
Yes, and they are loopholes and oversights rather than deliberate, I think. But nonetheless, it does present that risk that if someone was acting improperly, there would be more ability for them to be able to do damage.
So these would be weaknesses, could be identified in the criminal justice system. These failures could have a ripple effect in the outcomes of cases.
Potentially.
Yeah. Could I go to the other one that you'll be well aware of? Was that the Randolph's misconduct seems to have happened despite audits and accreditation. And one of your key remits is setting and maintaining standards. What lessons have you drawn from this case in terms of ensuring compliance with the standards that indeed I think you're responsible for setting or improving?
Yes. Well, I think one of the main lessons is that back in around about 2011 there was a case in the civil courts that went very badly wrong, including a company called Trimega, which, as you will know, has been implicated in this malpractice. Now, if there had been some sort of system for flagging up cases that went wrong in civil or family courts, then there would have been the potential to catch it earlier. So we do need to think about what do we do around flagging concerns that come from outside the criminal justice system. Because when we think about that situation, Trimega wasn't operating in the criminal justice setting and never entered really the criminal justice setting. Now, Randox happened to employ a couple of staff who used to work there, but there was no way of tracking back to see that those individuals had worked at a company that had been criticised in a court in another jurisdiction, in the civil jurisdiction. Normal vetting procedures for forensic staff wouldn't normally include whether they or their company that they had worked for previously had been the subject of criticism in a court case. And even if that were to be put in as a requirement, there isn't a system for capturing that sort of criticism. So, for example, in the criminal courts, in my office scans all the appeal court rulings, because the appeal court rulings are available to scan generally, and we would look for and find anything that was highlighted by the appeal court. But often in the lower courts, you wouldn't get anything highlighted that had gone wrong. So now in the criminal justice system, for people who are compliant with the codes of practice and conduct, there's a very clear requirement to escalate what has gone on. So there are very clear escalation requirements, and organisations must report to me when things have gone wrong. But in this case, something came from elsewhere. It wasn't escalated in that jurisdiction. One could think of it infecting almost the criminal justice system, and there was no central record anywhere of that judicial criticism.
Yeah. From memory, the Randox case, a lot of them may have emanated from the lower courts. A lot were driving offences, if I recall.
Yes, but there was no judicial criticism in those early cases. The criticism was of something went badly wrong at Trimega in a family case or a civil case.
Prior to?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that one's one that we will continue to consider. We have tried before to think about whether there is a way we can get all judicial criticism flagged, and we haven't found a way to do that yet, but we will continue to consider that. There's another important one which is already incorporated into the codes of practice and conduct, and the requirement to be accredited to the codes of practice and conduct kicked in October 2017. So Randox was not accredited to the codes of practice and conduct. And one of those requirements is a separation of responsibilities, so that the same person should never be responsible for development of a method, testing of the method, and then dealing with complaints and inquiries as to how that method has been performed. And so that separation of activities is very important and is now part of the codes.
So that you always have a challenge.
Yes, there should always be an independent challenge before a method is brought into routine use to check that its development and validation has been done properly.
And thank you for that. And finally, are you confident that there's enough audit being done vis-a-vis the self-assessment or self-compliance? Is there enough independent checks? Are we too heavily reliant on companies, large or small, indulging in self-assessment to achieve the standards or self-compliance? Do we need more audits? Are we getting it just about right? Are they working to your satisfaction? bearing in mind the standard setting?
So we have the independence comes from UCAS, United Kingdom Accreditation Service, conducting independent audits, but they are only in for a few days a year. And so what that system is all predicated on is that UCAS goes in to check, is there a proper quality system, and is that quality system functioning properly, and are all the internal checks and balances functioning properly, and so on. So they can't go in and check absolutely everything in those few days that they're in. So I think that one of the things that they will start to do is have a bit more variety in the different ways that they assess, in a bit more spontaneity, so that people can't predict how they're going to be audited. They're going to do more vertical audit, right down to raw data, to try and make sure that is identified. And the other thing that we're going to try and do is also strengthen the whistleblowing procedures as well, in case there is somebody in an organisation who is concerned about what's going on and has not yet referred it. So there's already a requirement on organisations to refer matters to me that could have an impact on public confidence or cause a miscarriage of justice. But whilst I have always encouraged any individual also to report a problem, there will be situations where individuals do not feel comfortable to do that in their organisation. So there are two things there. One is that I'm not a prescribed person under the relevant legislation, so I'd like to get that changed. And the other thing that I'm developing is an anonymous reporting facility, hopefully through my website, that people will, if they feel uncomfortable going through their organisation, be able to report concerns to me anonymously.
So it's clear that you need more influence or power to manage it better. Are you confident there is a safe route for a confident route for somebody who has a concern to raise that through your you said there's a website. Is it a confident route? Can they have confidence in that matters they raise will be addressed?
Well, they can have confidence that if they raise something, we will certainly review and look at it. It's much easier to look at something if we do have the detail. It's much more difficult to look at an anonymous referral, but we will attempt to do so. One of the things that's just recently come to my attention is that there are a number of doctors who've not felt that they could speak up about being asked to examine complainant and also suspect in the same case, and that's very concerning if people don't feel that they can speak up. But we do have a complaints and referral system.
Do whistleblowers contact you, even though the system isn't adequate? Perhaps do they still contact you?
This came to me through an investigative journalist who's been looking into these issues, so people didn't even contact me directly. There was one doctor who had raised a similar concern some years ago, and on the back of that I contacted the company, I contacted all chief constables, and I issued guidance on the issue. But it seems clear from the work being undertaken now by some journalists that there are still these issues happening despite having done those things. So that is a concern.
Thank you very much.
And you need to be. Did you say that you need to be prescribed in some way under the regulations, under the PEDA legislation?
Yes. Let me just find it. It is the. That's it. Yes, being a nominated person under the whistleblowing legislation, which does have I can't find the formal name just here.
That's the action you would like us to recommend, that you become a nominated person under the whistleblowing legislation. Yes. Do you also think that there needs to be more awareness of doctors in the system that you're there and to whistleblow to you?
Yes, I mean my role only impinges very, very slightly on the role of any medical professionals, because they're regulated by the General Medical Council and not by me. But the anti-contamination measures for collection of DNA samples is what I've issued guidance on. Now I've spent time, and this year I've done, I think, 4 or 5 presentations at conferences where forensic medical examiners go to raise awareness of these issues. But yes, there's always room for raising awareness further.
But your nomination as a person to whom people can raise concerns is critically important for their protection.
For their protection,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Damien.
In your annual report, you raised the prospect that it would become unsustainable for any forensic service to be managed within some police forces as they grapple with having to deliver an accredited high-quality forensic service. So how real a prospect is this, and how many forces might be in this situation?
I think the situation that I'm really drawing to the attention of chief officers in that part of my report is that I very much understand that chief officers are under a great deal of pressure to sort out, they have anti-terrorism to deal with, they have child protection to deal with, they have all sorts of rising crime to deal with. My concern is that amidst all those pressures, can the top of an organisation at chief officer level give sufficient attention to achieving quality standards in forensic science? And some of them clearly can and have achieved the quality standards, but there are other police forces that have not achieved the quality standards and are consistently failing to meet the deadlines. And so in my view, something different has to happen. So, as I say, I'm meeting with the Performance and Standards Lead from the MPCC to see what we can do to support chief officers and to try and raise the profile of that. But it's particularly important in areas that are outside what was traditionally considered forensics in policing. So things like collision investigation, which is a highly analytical set of activities that really needs to be very carefully controlled, but has traditionally sat within roads policing. And the chief officer lead in roads policing is unlikely to understand a great deal about forensic science and quality standards. So I think we really need to look at whether some police forces decide that they don't want to be involved with this sort of thing, or those that do. And that may be something that the police's own Transforming Forensics programme looks at in due course.
Do you have any idea on the amount of police forces that might be failing? Have you got a number that you would...
No, I don't. I mean, I can...
Roughly, yeah.
I've given numbers on who's so far failed to meet the deadlines, but whether those forces can get into gear, meet the requirements and demonstrate not only that they can meet them initially, but that they can sustain them. Because this is not a one-off push to get accreditation, then we can all breathe again. This is a way of working, and it's a culture that has to be developed. And if it's just a box-ticking exercise to get a badge, then it brings no value. It has to be a cultural change that says quality is really important, and doing things according to these guidelines is really important.
Especially if the checks aren't there.
Yes.
From outside. Okay. So, in, say, 2 years' time, where do you think the market in forensics will be as police forces move away from that? Will it be the private sector, do you think?
Well, I don't know if police forces will move away. What I would say is I think now is the time that I really feel that there needs to be a review of policy concerning forensic science that says, what is it we want to guarantee for forensic science in this country, for the criminal justice system? Who do we want to guarantee access to those services for? What services do we want to ensure that we have continuity of supply for? And how are we going to make that happen? And if that is a mixed economy between private and public sector, then some sort of strategy needs to be in place to ensure that there is continuity of supply and that there is appropriate payment for what is difficult and complex work.
So possibly a mixture of the two then?
It could be. I mean, I think that, to me it seems that we need to just take stock now. We've just suddenly ended up in a situation that could have been, had there not been emergency funding provided, could have jeopardised thousands of cases and still could potentially result in us losing a great deal of skill from what we have available. at the minute, we have this very complex situation where we have the vast majority of the sort of analytical and interpretive skills sitting in the commercial sector, the majority of fingerprint comparisons sitting in policing. Fire investigation, that's a good example. A lot of it's sitting in the commercial sector and the fire and rescue service. Now, there's a requirement for fire investigation to meet standards by 2020, but currently the fire and rescue services aren't paid by the police for delivering fire investigation and have no actual legal requirement to investigate fires. So some of the fire and rescue services are saying, well, if we have to meet standards, we can't afford to do it, we won't do it anymore. So there needs to be a policy that says what services do we need, how are we going to ensure that they are sufficiently recompensed in order to be able to meet the required standards. And we need to make sure that those commissioning processes across whatever sectors the services sit in take account of the national status of sustainability and not just the impact of one contract at a time.
Okay, thank you.
So you're being very clear about the need for a review and to set very clear standards and to have a mechanism for maintaining those standards. That sounds to me like you're saying that the forensic strategy from 2 years ago hasn't delivered that.
Yes.
And would you agree that the public has a right to know that everyone involved in this meets standards and maintains those standards, and that we can't have a situation where police forces, for example, are failing to hit deadlines, failing to meet the standards that you require? This is not acceptable, is it?
That's absolutely true. And not just police forces, some of these small companies
the small
as well.
companies as well. Thank you very much. Darren?
You kindly wrote to us in January saying out some of the statutory powers that you thought would help you do your role around setting enforceable standards that you could investigate and then take enforcement action against if they weren't being set. Could you just explain to the committee to help us understand what the risks are of not having those statutory powers? So what do the outcomes look like of you not having those powers?
I think the main outcome is that I don't believe we can get this resistant small number of companies to get to where they need to go. And again, I think the vast majority of policing is on board with reaching the standards, albeit they're behind. But I think there are a few who are quite reluctant still. So in my view, I think we can reach 80 to 90% compliance with the standards without statutory powers, but I don't think we'll ever get to full compliance.
And that will then assumedly be an ongoing issue if you can't investigate and enforce.
Yes, it makes it very difficult, particularly to investigate, because until companies or organisations really properly adopt the standards and the culture that goes with that, then they're not looking for failures and they're not reporting failures. So one of the problems we come up against when we set standards in a new area is everybody says, oh, there's no problem with this area. What's the problem? And that's been very much so in digital forensics. And one of the issues is that until really people understand the standards, start looking for the issues, they're not seeing the problems because they're not looking for them. So I think we'll have an ongoing problem in investigating problems because we just won't see them.
Sure. Thank you. Why have you not got statutory powers yet? Why do you think you've not been given them? It's a question that I think really needs to be addressed to the Home Office. I think there have been clear calls from this committee and from myself over a number of years, I think going back to about 2011. So I am very disappointed that it hasn't reached sufficient priority to make it onto the government's legislative programme, albeit the Home Office is working to draft legislation at the moment and has gone through that with me, and it should, if a suitable parliamentary vehicle can be found to get it onto the statute book, it should meet the requirements. So that's good news. So the Home Office has started to draft it up for you.
Yes, but it's not part of the government's legislative programme.
Okay, so it's when it will get introduced. So assumedly that means that it needs to be tagged on to some primary legislation in your perspective, right? There's no law that exists where you could put this as secondary legislation.
No, it is a primary issue of primary legislation.
Okay. And in your letter in January, you raised some concerns around the data protection bill, which is coming to the House probably after recess now.
Yes.
Can
Can you just explain to us what those concerns were about?
So there are exclusions in the bill coming before the House for a variety of regulators in that bill, and there are no. I'm not listed as one of those regulators, so there are no exclusions at present. So, for example, the issue of subject rights. There is a very significant issue of the investigations that I do into complaints and referrals, because those may involve a number of data subjects who may be complainants or suspects or members of staff at forensic organisations or policing. And there is no way that I can then make contact with all those data subjects and give them their right to be forgotten and all those other rights that are enshrined in GDPR and still do an effective investigation. So I think there's an issue there. There's also an issue that we're currently seeking legal advice on, which is the issue of lawfulness of processing and which category my role actually falls into, if any. So there are some quite substantial issues with the bill currently before the House.
How does that compare with today, though? Because surely you're able to do your role today under current data protection law. So
Yes.
Are you noted as somebody that has those exclusions today and they've just missed it in the drafting of the bill? I don't understand what's changing on the.
I think there are much greater rights under the new legislation. So at the minute I am registered as a data controller with the Information Commissioner's Office and clearly attempt to be as compliant as possible with that current regulation. But there are much broader powers in the new legislation, particularly around the data subjects.
Vicky?
You said regulators have been given special status in that bill. What are the regulators?
I don't have that information to hand, but I could
let you know. But it'd be very helpful to, if they're similar.
I believe they're mostly, it's probably a list of statutory regulators.
So they probably go together.
Yes.
We can identify those.
Yeah. But I think that's time critical, isn't it? Because the bill is going through at the moment, so presumably if we need to do that, it will be a time critical issue.
Yes, make the point, it might be that we ask the Home Office whether they think if you're going to be included as an amendment to the bill, whether those statutory powers could be brought in at the same time.
It would be a good question to ask.
Thank you, Jen.
Vicky?
Yes, we're going to be asking the Minister about the delay or the timing of producing a biometric strategy. What role have you had in the work underway to develop that biometric strategy?
I've not been involved in the development of the biometric strategy.
Have you asked to be involved?
No, I was involved in a very, very early draft at one point, but beyond that, I have had some involvement with the biometrics programme, which is ongoing because a load of strategies...
So hold on a second. You start off with a very firm statement saying I've not been involved, and then you've just said I was involved in a very, very early draft.
I believe that very early draft was completely abandoned, is my understanding. So the current strategy I have not seen and I have not been asked to comment on.
Okay.
But the Home Office Biometric Programme, which is currently working to develop systems for fingerprints and facial identification and DNA, I do have input on some elements of that programme. So my team have run various workshops with the Home Office Biometrics Programme about how that programme might be able to support the fingerprint comparison community in maintaining the standards for fingerprint comparison.
Do you believe that programme fits into the strategy?
Well, because I haven't seen this strategy, I can't...
Do you think you should be involved in it?
I mean, really, the biometric strategy has not got... I don't anticipate it'll have much to do with quality standards at all, and my role is only on quality standards. So I think the strategy will concern, the more issues of privacy and issues of control of data and so on, and that will be more the remit of the Biometrics Commissioner.
Yeah, thank you.
So what role do you have in the various biometric oversight bodies? We've been told that there are oversight bodies. Do you play a role in this?
I sit as an external on the Forensic Information Databases Strategy Board, which covers the DNA database and the governance of the fingerprint database. So
I'm not a core member of that board because to preserve my independence, I need to sit as an independent on that board, so I do have input into that. I don't sit on the Home Office Biometrics Programme Board because I'm told that is a delivery-related board and not a strategic or a board that would be concerned with quality.
And do you have a role in trying to influence discussions about how biometrics are collected and retained, or is it mostly on how they're processed in the labs, or the two are?
They are interlinked. So, for example, at the Forensic Information Databases Strategy Board, we would discuss issues like, for example, when individuals are questioned without being arrested and when their biometrics are taken in those circumstances. So those issues do pass by the Strategy Board, and I have an opportunity to input at that point.
I think that's the last of our questions here, but I just wanted to check if there was anything else that you wanted to add, because you've made a number of sort of serious concerns about different testing organisations, and I don't have a overview about whether or not you're concerned about a huge majority of the testing organisations, or whether or not it's a small number of them. You say something small, so I can't sort of get my head around the order of magnitude of how of this issue.
Yes. Well, I would say that a large majority of the forensic science that is delivered in England and Wales is delivered to a good quality.
Thank you.
I think that it is my role to look at where the gaps and risks and issues are, and so sometimes my reports can look very negative because I will be concentrating on those issues. I think also it's interesting when we look at international comparators, and you know, there aren't other roles like mine in other countries, so you don't get that intense scrutiny, for example, on what the police are doing as well as what the laboratories are doing. So sometimes the perception can be that it's all rather negative. There are a lot of very good forensic scientists doing very good work out there, but a lot of them are frustrated that they don't work in an optimal system that enables them to do the best work that they could do.
And in any review and the construction of a new framework, presumably the family and civil courts need to be part of that.
I think they certainly need to be considered, yes.
I mean, the potential for miscarriages of justice in, say, the family court could have very serious consequences. Imagine that you would see the importance of ensuring high standards there as well.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from anyone? Yes, Martin and then Vicky.
Or can I just invite you to add to that last? Would the involvement of the family courts in a review provide a vehicle for you to have the sort of judicial oversight to spot errors that are highlighted in family courts? Would this be a vehicle to put that joined-up thinking in place from your point of view?
Potentially, yes.
Potentially, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Vicky?
No, I think it's just, I think what you said about the vast majority good practice is important to say, to reassure good practice as well as helping you to identify and have the powers to take action against areas where the
yes, and I think, you know, being realistic, you know, for example, fingerprint comparison, it has gone on for 100 years in this country and other countries without this level of oversight, and I think that has to change. It absolutely has to change so that the courts can be given assurance that all the right quality measures are there.
And Chairman, if I may, I just want to make sure that we get from Dr. Tully the specific actions that she would like us to take. So if it is, look at the bill and make sure that I have got the right powers that I need under the changes to data protection laws, then we know what the actions are in order to be able to do that, because otherwise you'll be coming back in 2 years' time and we're saying again it's not good enough. So I think we really need to know what the specific actions are that we can take.
You wrote to us after the briefing. Does that letter set out fully the steps that you think are necessary, or do you want to consider adding to that to ensure that, because we may well produce something following this hearing, because you've raised some serious issues that need to, I think, be put to government. We want to make sure we've captured everything, as Vicky says.
Well, that letter really was about the statutory power, so I will consider whether there's anything further that I should put down in writing to the
And you said a little while ago that a draft bill has been developed,
yes.
and it sounded to me like you're positive about what it contains.
Yes, I think it has been simplified as much as possible in order to ensure that it tries to make a good passage through the House. But I think it...
But have you had any reassurance on when... I appreciate it's not in the current programme, but have you had any reassurance about when it might get time, what priority the government sees that it needs to give to this?
I have been given an outline timetable, but it's not as part of the government's programme. Right.
Can you give us any indication of what that timetable consists of?
That would be, I believe that it may be introduced to the House within a couple of months.
Ah, so something perhaps may be imminent. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Welcome, Baroness Williams. Very good to see you, and hello, Mr. Prince, as well. Do you both want to just very briefly introduce yourselves?
Yeah, I'm Susan Williams, Minister of State in the Home Office, and I cover as policy areas biometrics, identity, data, and counter-extremism.
Great, thank you.
Christoph Prince, recently appointed Director of Data and Identity in the Home Office.
Thanks very much indeed. So back in 2015, the government told the predecessor committee to this that it was developing two separate but aligned forensic and biometric strategies. And the government said it remained committed to publishing both of those strategies by the end of 2015. Why are we still waiting for the biometric strategy?
Well, I have to, although 2015 is a bit before my time, I can only apologise that you have not got the biometric strategy. Obviously, we produced the forensic strategy. When I took over the policy area, there was several things that I was quite clear about, and one was that a government-wide strategy actually did not fit the bill of what we wanted to achieve, because different government departments use biometrics for different purposes. Home Office use them for quite distinct purposes, as do, say, DCMS.
So you saw that the scope was wide?
The scope was too wide. I also saw, and I think that's been clearer more recently, that actually the pace of biometrics is moving quite rapidly. And I wanted to have something that was flexible and fit for the future in this quite fast changing area.
Isn't the development, the rapid development, as you've described, the very reason why you need to have a clear legal framework strategy in place? Because things are changing on the ground as we speak. The technologies are being deployed. in a way that some say is unlawful. And isn't that the very reason why we need something in place quite urgently?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is the reason why we need something in place quite urgently. It also is the reason why we need to get the framework for the strategy absolutely right, so that it's not only fit for the future, but also gets those ethical and legal questions absolutely fixed within it, of why we're doing what we're doing, and how we deploy our policy. The other point that that might please the committee is that, all that said, I hope to be able to bring the strategy to you in June.
In June, right?
In June.
Well, I appreciate you offering us clarity on that. I mean, the original plan was that the forensic strategy and the biometric strategy would be aligned.
Yeah.
Is that still the intent? I mean, it becomes more difficult when they're separated in time, but is that still the intent? And just an additional supplementary to that, Dr. Tully sort of made it clear to us that the forensic strategy hadn't really delivered the clear framework to deliver the high standards across the board that she felt was very necessary.
Yeah. I mean, just because they are distinct does not mean that they can't also be aligned. I mean, if you think about... So I have the kind of overarching look across the piece.
So you're responsible for both strategies, are you?
Well, forensics would be very clearly in the criminal area, and that would be Nick Hurd's area, the policing. But of course, in the immigration sphere, biometrics are incredibly important. So you can see why they're both distinct and aligned, because of course we operate across the piece.
So you personally don't have any overview of the two strategies together? It's divided between the two ministers?
No, it's not divided between us. What I'm saying is that although they're distinct, there is alignment, and there are often times when Nick and I work together on a specific thing.
Darren, do you want to come in on that?
Sorry.
And then Christoph, you can come in, but Darren first.
We had the Digital Minister, Margot James, in our committee, I think it was last week, who was talking about the new data ethics and AI unit that's being set up in DCMS. I appreciate it's very early stages, but do you have any thoughts on how, because my understanding from that hearing was that that's going to be a cross-departmental function, albeit hosted in DCMS. To that point of stuff in the Home Office, stuff in Justice, stuff in DCMS, do you have any views on how that ought to work to help you get this right cross-departmentally?
Yeah, well, certainly in the area of identity, we've already started cross-departmental talks, certainly with DCMS, because some of these things are whole government issues, although each department needs to have a very clear idea of how what they do will actually implicate on another department of government. So yes, we work together across government, but we also have our distinct policy areas.
Christoph, did you want to add something?
Yeah. On the question of alignment, one of the reasons for establishing the Data and Identity Directorate was to ensure that we did have alignment, and I have also responsibility for the forensics strategy within my directorate, so we can ensure that there is a linkage.
So you're the glue that binds it all together?
Yes.
Attempt to be.
So your letter to us last November spoke of the further work that needed to be done in some areas before you delivered the strategy. Could you give any more clarity on what those areas are? I mean, it's great to know that it will now come in June, and that's wonderfully precise. I know that government departments tend to talk in seasons, which are more flexible than months, but can you give us some guidance about the areas that you've been working on?
Yeah, I mean, as I've said to you, I wanted to clarify the scope of the strategy, but I also wanted a framework for governance and oversight, which I think is so important in this area, because we do need the public to trust that what we're doing is not only clearly legal, but that we articulate clearly why we're using biometrics for what purpose.
Yeah. So your letter tells us that the Custody Image Review reported its findings in February 17, a year ago. Are there any other reviews that still need to be finished before you can publish the strategy in June?
There are no other planned reviews I can report.
Okay.
And as I say, I plan to publish the strategy in June of this year.
Thank you very much. Martin.
Thank you. I was going to ask questions about the forensic science strategy, so maybe these are pointed as much to Christoph. In 2016, there was it was referred to a review by the police force about creating a joint forensic biometric service. How's that progressing?
It is progressing fine.
Good. If we bore into that a little bit further.
The work on developing the capacity and capability in the police to deal with biometrics and forensics, particularly in forensics, is being taken forward through the Transforming Forensics programme, which has done some initial work and is the more recent proposals are being looked at the moment, which have recently been put together by the police. Exactly how they will then provide improved forensic services themselves and working with the market will depend on the outcomes of that programme.
And presumably also await at least until June when the biometric strategy is published.
Yeah. Elements of what they do will be influenced by the biometric strategy, but most of the forensics work will be
already be done.
Or will be set, the direction set by the strategy. Is
there a time scale that you can share that you're working towards for this? Seasonal or otherwise?
Not at the moment. The latest proposals from the police for the Transforming Forensics programme have just been submitted and are being reviewed at the moment. Decisions should be taken shortly, which will then decide on which elements to be taken forward, but I can't give specific times on that.
Right. At the moment, there is a combination of bodies that oversee the fingerprints and DNA. Is there anticipated that there's going to be an oversight framework for the other types of biometrics that are being envisaged?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that governance and oversight arrangements have grown over successive governments, and I think it would be fair to say that they're quite complicated at this stage. So what I want to ensure is that they operate clearly and smoothly. And at this stage, what we're doing is considering the formation of a board that would bring together the main commissioners together with the police.
So, I suppose just progressing that, the forensic regulator covers obviously the criminal justice system, but we've heard earlier about problems with the disconnect that the family and civil courts aren't part of that. Do you accept that there's a gap, I suppose, is the first simple question, and secondly, what do you think you can bring or offer to narrow that gap?
Well, I just heard the end of your interview with the Forensics Commissioner, and actually I met with her last week, and it is our intention to actually put the Commissioner on, put the regulator on a statutory basis. And I think that will give them robust enforcement powers, but I think we will at this stage limit it to the criminal justice system.
So do you think there's a debate? I mean, you've hinted at this, the split between the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice. Do you think there's a debate to be had about who should manage the whole of forensics and biometrics, or are you confident that this joint body will be a way of allowing cross-departmental work successfully?
I'm confident that the joint body will work. I mean, you cannot, in whatever you're looking at it, whether it's forensics, biometrics, or indeed many other areas of government, you cannot neatly package them into one department or indeed one minister very, very often. So I am confident that this arrangement should work.
but often it's where they cross jurisdictions that the problems occur, like we've heard today.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your confidence in what's being proposed.
Well, this time next year when you call me back.
Absolutely. Well, funnily enough, I was just... No.
Thank you for confirming your availability. Bill.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The Biometrics Commissioner advises that there are at least 19 million, a significant number of facial images retained in the Police National Database. Do you see that as a good thing for securing or identifying criminal suspects, or is there immense conflict with what one would say potentially excessive intrusion or privacy, or is there enough measures in place to allay those fears? Yeah. So what one comes up to the top?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right that you have to decide, there is a line between maintaining privacy but also maintaining public protection. Our view is that there aren't 19 million facial images. There are actually 21 million people on the PND. But those not 21 million, but 21 million images, not people. So of those...
You mean there may be many images that are of the same person?
Exactly. And there also may be images that are tattoos or scars. So 21 million does not equate to number of people.
It's not individuals. It might be tattoos appertaining to an individual, of which there are a series of pictures.
Yes.
So that inflates the figure.
That inflates the figure.
But it does include many people who are innocent, who have had no proceedings pursued against them.
Well, perhaps I'll get on to that as well in terms of the custody image review.
Sure.
But of those 21 million images, we estimate that about 12.5 million of those are actually searchable. But of those searchable images, they again don't equate to 12.5 million people. They equate to 12.5 million searchable images, i.e. images that can be used. So that's putting it in context. So the number of images is more than you think, but it doesn't equate to the number of people. Obviously the custody images review came in, I think it was last year, as I seem to recall. It gets reviewed, and there are clearly someone who is innocent can apply to have their image taken away, and it will be taken down. Clearly, there are decisions around public safety. So there are various categories of the types of people for whom images are kept. And
could you confirm how many applications there have been in that 2-year period to have images removed, and what percentages of those have been successful?
Right. I haven't got that information. Christoph, have you got it?
So we're in the process of gathering that information from police forces in order to understand the number of requests for deletion and the number that have been approved. So that's something.
Can you write to us?
Yes, we will do.
Thank you very much. As much detail of that would be appreciated.
Okay.
I'll move on, and you finished with that one? Yep.
If I've answered it to your satisfaction.
It's my turn now to have that. You did mention the custody image review, and the system has been amended. The guidelines, I would imagine, have been improved or amended. Yeah. Do you think the guidelines are sufficiently clear for all police forces to apply a consistent and uniform interpretation of these rules? Are they robust enough for equity and fairness in application?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair question. I haven't got any evidence that it's not working well, but what I have done is ask for further information about how it's been applied to assure both ourselves and, of course, the public that it's working well.
So there is a degree. There's no evidence to suggest it's not working.
There's no negative evidence out there, but we're just seeking that further assurance.
Yeah. And finally, if I could reflect.
Sorry, I think Christoph want to come in.
I was going to add, in terms of the assessment that's been made by the police with respect to the removal or otherwise, the National Retention Assessment Criteria template has been put in place. It builds on common tools that the police use to assess whether or not to retain those images, and that should help drive through some of the consistency in the way in which police make decisions around its use.
So you're sensing a commonality and a sort of level playing field.
The guidance is there intended to drive it, and there's nothing to suggest otherwise.
Yeah, thank you. Again, the Biometrics Commissioner has expressed concerns. I think the up-and-coming strategy and proposals. He's raised concern that the police forces, it may evolve to be a sort of postcode lottery. It's almost like the previous question. Is he justified in his concerns, or is he overreacting to it? Is his concerns justified?
Well, I think the rules are very clear that if someone is not convicted of an offence, they have the right to request that the custody image is removed from all police databases. So I think that the rules are very, very clear. And it comes with a general presumption that it must be removed, unless police consider that there's an exceptional case for retaining it. And an exceptional case for retaining it might be that if they're on the VISA system, the Violent Sex Offenders Register, or a potentially dangerous person, that would be a reason to retain. But the police obviously look at each case on its own merit.
Could it just be on the sexual offences register?
Sorry?
Well, if somebody's on the sexual offenders register, will there not be a facial image of that person anyway?
There will be on the VISA register, but as I understand it, VISA gets uploaded to PND, or PND gets... VISA gets uploaded to PND. So when you request the removal, you request, I understand, the removal of all images.
I don't know if there are actual images kept on VISA or whether those are kept in a separate position.
Actually, that's the point, yeah. So VISA might be just simply a database
of biographic details.
Yeah, as opposed to images.
That's something I could check.
Could you write to us and confirm?
Yeah, I understand that PND is where the images are kept.
Thank you.
Just back to the lottery aspect of it. There is, in the proposals, there's a human element of decision making and a sort of flexibility in decision making. There might be a variation in that. Is there a risk goes with that discretion? Is there a risk of that discretion being used thinly or lightly or varied throughout the forces?
Well, in terms of retention, they have actually got to have the approval of a chief officer in order to retain. So that might include something like the individual being subject of an ongoing investigation. But they are the rules around continued retention, and I guess that unless it's retained, it should be removed.
But there is a risk from varying chief constables throughout the area. There could be a variation in how they approach it.
I guess there always could be, yeah, because you bring into question human element. But if there are clear rules around it, that lessens that risk.
You're confident that they would be followed by the various chief constables who would dare with a degree of equity, if they're following the rules.
Yeah, if they're following the rules, yeah.
Darren, did you want a quick supplement?
Thanks very much.
Just a quick on the databases question, and
yes.
I appreciate you may want to throw it back to us, but with my other hat on in the EU Scrutiny Select Committee, there's been quite a few documents that have come before us for scrutiny around European databases for collection of facial recognition, fingerprint and other biometrics at various points, either on border control or elsewhere. Do you know whether that information is held on EU databases or UK databases? And has your department been doing any preparations for whatever the outcome of Brexit might be to ensure that UK citizens' information is protected in that process?
Well, there may be EU citizens. Will there be EU citizens' information on the PND? There could well be. In terms of the second part of your question, I mean, clearly we've just done the data protection bill, certainly the Home Office elements of the data protection bill, one of the most complex bills that I've ever had to bring through, but which aligns certainly the law enforcement directive with UK law. So I'm confident that there is good alignment there. And it may well be the case that there are EU citizens' images on the PND if there is a necessity to put them on the PND because of for the reasons I've outlined.
And we're happy from the Bill's perspective that the mechanisms are in place as part of negotiations with the European Union, that there shouldn't be any unexpected risks around that.
Around the LED?
Yeah.
Well, the LED, so because it's a directive, there is a direct transposition into UK law.
Yeah.
So in terms of it being robust, in terms of meeting EU requirements, because it's a direct transposition, I am confident. Clearly, I can't see into the future if rules change, but as we stand, it robustly copies the LED. And I would say in this space that UK have led the way really on law enforcement and data protection across the EU. So we are one of the states that lead, but obviously we're a state that's leaving.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask you, your letter to us of the 1st of February said, and I quote, "Chief officers have the discretion to retain a custody image where this is necessary for a policing purpose,
yes,
and there is an exceptional reason to do so."
Yes.
Now, I assume that when you say there is an exceptional reason to do so, that means that we're talking about quite a small minority of cases where... So, just to be clear, quite apart from the right for a citizen to request a deletion of an image, when someone has been arrested, perhaps interviewed, image has been taken, a decision has been taken not to pursue criminal proceedings against them, everything's been dropped, presumably what you're saying in the letter is at that point the image should be deleted, unless there are exceptional circumstances.
I'm not saying the image... There is a presumption of deletion if the criteria are met, but it would not, as you say, necessarily be deleted. For example, if that person was...
but the only reason not to delete at that point, irrespective of a request from the citizen, it ought to be only in exceptional circumstances, where there are exceptional reasons that image should not be deleted at that point. Because I'm told that actually routinely images are kept still, and that it would require a citizen to make a request for it to be deleted.
That's correct. That is correct.
But that amounts surely to an unlawful policy. If we look at the 2012 case law and the Biometric Commissioner's annual report, where they refer to the unlawful retention regime that was in place, the retention of images of innocent people unless and until they apply is an unlawful policy, is it not?
I mean, in an ideal world...
let's just deal with the law. Yeah. Is this not an unlawful policy, based on what your letter says?
I think it was deemed not to be unlawful to...
Yes, the view was, and the view remains, that the implementation of the custody image review is sufficient to meet the 2012 ruling. It will be only on application that a decision will be taken in order to retain or remove.
So is the Biometrics Commissioner content with that all images are retained unless and until someone comes forward to make an application?
So there is a separate review process that is in place for any image that is on the system. Therefore, it won't be that they would be retained indefinitely. It would have to be reviewed after a certain period of time. The image will have to be reviewed after a certain period of time.
I'm still a bit unclear because you've said that actually, in accordance with your letter, it would only be if there was an exceptional reason. In other words, in the vast majority of cases, they ought to routinely be deleted if the person has no proceedings brought against them. But you're also now saying that actually routinely images are kept unless and until there's an application to delete.
The removal will only be undertaken when there is a request. There's no mechanism at the moment to automatically connect the non-conviction to the custody image, therefore to prompt the police to make that removal. So it relies on, at the moment, a request to be made in order for that.
That was the point I was going to.
Contradiction, as I understand what's been said. They've said all images are kept unless the individual says take my image away, and then the image is pretty much automatically taken away, unless it's an exceptional circumstance that is considered that person poses an extra risk. And I don't.
That's not the point.
That's how I understand you have explained it.
Right, but the letter says something different. Chief officers have the discretion to retain a custody image where this is necessary for a policing purpose, and there is an exceptional reason to do so. So irrespective of a request, because most people won't even know that they have a right to make a request, and I'd be interested to know how often and how that information is disseminated to people about their right to make a request. But irrespective of a request, it should only be retained if there's an exceptional reason to do so.
And that's what they've said.
No,
that's what it says in the letter.
Absolutely not. It's not what they're saying at all.
So it will only be retained if there's an exceptional reason to do so after a request has been made in circumstances.
Well, okay, so if the vast majority of people have no idea of their right to request, then actually images continue to be retained, and it seems to me, under the 2012 case law, to be unlawful.
I think that the 2012, I think the ruling said that what we were doing was lawful, but what I was trying to say was that because there is no sort of automatic within the technology, there is no automatic deletion mechanism, and it's something that obviously in due course.
Well, I understand you've made the point that it would be very costly to go through and clear out.
That is the position.
I understand that,
yeah.
But what I don't understand is when someone has been arrested, has had an image taken, a decision has been taken that they should not have criminal proceedings brought against them. What I do not understand is why that image should not be deleted at that point.
So, there's no mechanism for prompting that a decision to be taken on the retention at that particular point. But there are review periods in place to ensure that after a certain period of time, depending on the offence, the custody images retention will be reviewed in those circumstances. So depending on the offence, after 10 years or after 6 years, there will be a review of that image.
There should be?
Yeah, there should be.
By the individual police force?
By the police force.
Yes.
Yeah. Enormous question. Is it exactly the same policy that applies to the retention of DNA and fingerprints? That if somebody is not charged, I understood that the DNA record was destroyed and the fingerprints were taken off the record. So if that can be taken off the record, why can't the image?
Yeah, exactly.
Graham, because they're two different systems.
But that has quite serious implications for people's rights, doesn't it? I mean, the point has been made to me that in South Wales, they've been awarded a £2 million grant, South Wales Police, for automated facial recognition, and that they've got a database which includes many innocent people. And that, in effect, the Home Office appears to have justified significant spending on facial recognition software that utilises innocent people's images.
I mean, South Wales used the automatic facial recognition technology in quite a defined test way.
Six Nations.
Sorry, Six Nations. And not only did they very, very clearly publicised the purpose of the pilot event, and people were very clear about what was happening. It's not that they test; they're looking at every face in the crowd. They're testing the crowd against specific faces that they have for a particular.
Many of which will be innocent people.
No, the faces, the list of faces that they have are actually people who are wanted for criminal purposes. So the facial matching of the crowd actually aims to match.
So it doesn't
the
utilise
faces.
their database, which includes many innocent people.
Yes,
Not in that case, no.
In the circumstances where they deploy it, they'll have a identified list of individuals where they have a suspicion or a belief that they may be targeting that event or are known to be involved in those types of events, and they will use that as the basis against which they will identify facial images. They're also obliged to follow the Surveillance Camera Commissioner's Code of Conduct when using those arrangements, and so it'll be a specified list, not a generalised view, and not checking against a broad range of facial images, but only those that they deem relevant to that circumstance.
And could I just say, Chairman, at this point, that the technology is not fully developed at all yet, hence the quite controlled pilot arrangements that were in place.
Is it also right that the Met Police on Remembrance Day used a subset of people who had some mental health related issues and identified one person on that day and stopped them from proceeding down the street? Is that right?
I mean, I have literally no knowledge of that, but I can
you write to us if you
I can certainly look into that and write to you on it. I wouldn't want to give you false information.
Quickly, Bill.
It just entered my mind there. It's the data retention, image retention. I wonder where the strategy goes beyond, because you go on a bus, you go on a train, you go into a shopping mall, you go into a small corner shop. How does the law apply to these images? Are they somewhat totally separate as we go about our daily lives? Where does the policy or the strategy embrace these? Or is that,
well, I
just a thought. I don't know where they all go.
Inherent in your question is the sort of thing that I've been looking at, which is what we're doing legal, is what we're doing ethical, is what we're doing transparent, and is what we're doing robust? And does it have the public confidence?
It's just when you stop to think, Jared, of the imagery that is gathered on a daily basis, minute by minute, innocently, quietly, and going about our business, and it feels to me like a monster that's out there.
These things are potential monsters, which is why I think the government needs to be absolutely clear about why they're collecting and for what purpose.
I also value the safety that it brings for the protection of others and evidence in courts, etc. It's this balance. It's very complex. Need I remind you?
It is complex,
Martin, quickly, and then Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. So can I just clarify, the government is satisfied that the wide database of facial recognition is so valuable and so important that it outweighs what actually would seem to me to be a relatively simplistic task of putting a step in that would remove the individual's facial identity that was taken for an arrest when nothing further happened. And it relies firstly on 2 reviews sometime in the future, or that individual knowing and writing to the police to say, please remove my identity.
Yeah, in the case of facial images, that is
yes,
the case,
facial images.
And that has been deemed lawful.
And the government is satisfied that the value of the data as a whole outweighs what would seem to me to be a simplistic step of saying, when there's no further action, the image is removed? Or is it that there just is not a system? It has to rely on the individual to write in.
Because it is a different approach, as Graham has said, to the DNA.
It is. That's absolutely right.
I failed yet to understand the rationale beyond different systems, what the rationale, particularly in terms of human rights, is concerned, for a different approach to be taken to DNA as to facial recognition.
I mean, they are on different systems, and the use of DNA and fingerprints in criminal justice system is significantly more advanced, and in fact that's therefore reflected in the way in which the systems have been.
But that's no justification for a more lax system to apply to one type of identification than another.
And then and there are technical challenges in automating in the same way as we do for DNA and fingerprints.
But do you take the point that it's no justification for a different approach in terms of people's rights?
They've just grown up in different ways.
Yeah,
really.
but surely we have to get to a point where we apply the same principles across the board to all of these technologies. Do we not?
I was going to say, in terms of the same principles, but also answering the question around other uses and collection of data, the Data Protection Act, and as it's being updated at the moment, provides the baseline framework on which decisions around necessity, proportionality are applied for the use of any data, including facial images. And we will find there will be differences in particular uses around a particular image or say DNA or fingerprints. Both DNA and fingerprints we've specifically legislated for. For facial images, we're using the Data Protection Act, the Information Commissioner's Code of Conduct, the Surveillance Cameras Surveillance Camera Commissioner's Code of Conduct as well, and then with respect to the removal and retention, the guidance that's put to the police. So it is a slightly more complex framework at the moment. And the different uses will be different, but the principles of necessity, proportionality must be the same.
Stephen.
Thank you. I'd like to move on from retention just for a minute to collection of images. How does an image end up on the PND?
It ends up on the PND if the person has been convicted of a... Is it arrested or convicted? Arrested.
Only if they've been arrested. So the police collecting images of people in the street is a myth? Or
they wouldn't on the PND.
There will be some samples of images that have been collected from investigations that may be placed on the PND for suspects, for example. The PND acts as an intelligence database to enable people to identify individuals as part of investigations.
But would the individual know that they had had their image captured and potentially put onto the database?
In certain circumstances, no, but that will only arise where there is an active investigation and they've identified someone and they're looking to ensure that that's available to other police forces.
Okay, so when images have been collected from things like the Notting Hill Carnival, that would be because they are part of an active investigation?
I couldn't say exactly what happened in the Notting Hill Carnival circumstance, but they would have followed the Information Commissioner and the Surveillance Camera Commissioner's Code of Conduct with the retention of any images that may have come out of that only in specified circumstances.
Do you think the public are aware of the changes that have taken place in this particular area, the biometrics area? And is there a role for, one, greater education? Most people are now aware of the impact of DNA testing, fingerprints, but probably not of the fact there is a database of images, some of which they will be aware their image has been taken, some they may not, and that there is technology that is able to scan those images and potentially link your image with a potential crime and turn you into a suspect. One is, the question is, do you think the public awareness is as great as it should be? Two, is there something we collectively should be doing to raise that? And three, will the biometric strategy tackle some of those issues?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to raise those questions, Stephen, and I think that the ethical use of... I've said that we're looking to establish an oversight board to deal with the whole governance of and use of images. But I think certainly the strategy will help to deal with it, but I think there is a wider engagement needed from government in terms of getting the trust of the public about why we are using images, data, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I mean, the data covers a huge field to ensure public confidence. I mean, there is quite an interesting juxtaposition here that members of the public will give the most incredible amount of data to a faceless internet provider, but they are suspicious of what government might be doing when actually government, what they're trying to do is keep them safe. But we've got to be able to answer those questions.
I suppose it's because government runs the criminal justice system.
Absolutely, of course, yeah, of course. But it is amazing how people will make themselves vulnerable in other areas in giving so much away.
Sure. And you said this is a developing technology being used.
The automatic facial recognition.
The automatic. But the software that's used to scan an image or potentially compare images, is that fairly well-developed technology now?
Well, it is certainly developing. I wouldn't say it's perfect technology at all.
And the reason I'm asking is it delivering too many false positives from the facial recognition software?
The reason that it's being piloted rather than used widely is because the technology is developing.
Okay. And who is developing the technology? Is it a government collaboration? Is it purely commercial? Is it the same software that's being used on things like Facebook to identify your friends?
Yeah.
Pass.
Within the national systems and within the department, it's the Home Office Biometrics Programme, which is developing and replacing some of the existing infrastructure, and will also be, for some of that, providing some of the facial matching technology. And they go through a rigorous process of testing the outputs from those algorithms and the technology on which they sit. So that's part of that programme. There will be circumstances where other users may have slightly different algorithms or facial recognition technology running on their own systems, but nationally that's being done by the Home Office Biometrics Programme.
Okay. The Biometrics and Forensic Ethics Group signalled that the public's view needed to be sought. Because as I understand it, there are around 90% of us, of the adult population, have their images stored somewhere across government databases, including driving licences, passports, etc. And it's whether or not those images should be shared with the police. Do you have a view on this yet?
I just think it goes back to my point that we in government need to be clear, and the police need to be clear, that the reason for collecting, for giving consent has got to be legal, transparent and ethical.
Do you have a concern about that? I mean, you're absolutely right to define those sort of principles, but does that lead you to conclude that we probably will end up with those images from driving licences, passports, all available to the police from them on their national computer?
Well, I think if you go back to the principles, and the reason I'm so keen on a framework is that if you go back to those principles, you need to hold on to those principles, and it is very much government's job to do that, or else you start to get into the realms of, I remember a few years ago, council looking through your bins under counter-terrorism legislation. Well, clearly that is miles away from what we're talking about here, and we have to just make sure that we stick to those principles.
So, I mean, internationally, the Chinese are using this technology quite a lot, and there seems to be quite a lot of development here.
Yeah.
We've got to be careful about the direction we're going here, have we not? Been a lot of criticism about the Chinese for their use of facial recognition. We've got to be careful that we maintain exactly the principles that you articulate.
And that's where I thank God that we live in a democratic country.
Steve?
Yeah, it's really just a final point on if the public's view, and it is decided that those 90% of images are shared and the police have access to them in a live database, does that effectively mean we then have a national identity card?
No, I think we've moved well away from the national identity card.
Well, okay, but if the police can check live whether or not your photo on their database matches you in front of them, that is effectively the same thing, is it not?
I think the two are quite far away.
I mean, if I just may add, the police are able to access certain databases in order to verify identity in certain circumstances, where they have an investigation or a reasonable suspicion. Just because police may have access to, in principle, doesn't mean that in an individual circumstance they will be able to, or that it would be necessary and proportionate for them to do so.
But,
so there are other controls
but
around
nonetheless,
access.
in effect, if the police did have access to 90% of images through passports, driving licences and so forth, surely we end up in a situation where the police in effect hold our identity cards rather than us as citizens, and we become walking identity cards, don't we? I mean, that's the reality of what could be in store if the police have access to all of those images.
If you come back to the tenet that the police need to use the biometrics they've got for policing purposes, then that situation doesn't arise. But we need to be very clear.
It comes back to your point about building public support.
Absolutely, it does, yeah.
For this.
Yeah.
Stephen?
No, I'm done. Thank you,
Martin?
Thank you, Chair. Just to go back really to the relationship between the custody imagery review and fingerprints and DNA, are there any sort of significant issues about fingerprints that are holding up the strategy in June, or is all of that, all of those questions being posed and answered for you?
Well, I think the retention rules around DNA and fingerprints are actually well established, and I don't have any
no intention
about
to revisit.
No.
Do you have any concern about the variety of databases and locations that the DNA and fingerprints are held on? I think both the mix between the electronic fingerprints and the actual physical fingerprints that are taken. Is that of any concern or worry?
It's not something that's been expressed to me. Clearly, the electronic world is moving on. Technology is moving on. It may be in 20 years' time that they're all held electronically, but for the moment, both are.
The system that we have is working well, and there's no signs of crisis amongst it. Do you think the governance of fingerprints, it's not at the same standard as DNA? Do you think it should come up to that? Or, again, I'm probably saying, or are you just satisfied? I mean, given that fingerprints are probably the oldest form of identity that the police use, it's a more historic system. The DNA one is more modern. Are we going to bring fingerprints up to DNA, or are we just going to keep the system as it is?
I mean, I think putting the forensics regulator on a statutory footing, I think maybe questions like that might be something that she may look at, or he may look at in the future.
So once the
standards,
fine. So once the statutory footing is established, that would be something.
It may be a question.
It may be, yeah.
But I don't want to. I don't want to preempt what she might want to do.
Good. Do you have a time scale about when she's going to end up on a statutory footing? I just cheekily add that one in, actually.
Could I just use that terrible phrase, in due course?
She indicated that something might be imminent. Are you 2 months? Tom?
Well, due course in my world is in the next 3 months, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Reassuring. Thank you. You finished?
Yes.
Damien?
I'm just moving on to new biometrics. The Biometrics Commissioner's annual report raises the interesting prospect of new types of biometrics coming to the fore.
Yeah.
So voice, iris, gait analysis, and he envisages that big data analytics could, in the future, allow someone to bring all these different types of biometrics together. And do you see any need for safeguards in that respect?
I think the safeguards are the safeguards that we've been talking about this morning. So there are some very exciting developments, as you say, gait analysis, voice recognition, as well as the AFR technology. But I think they've all got to be, I mean, some of them are in very early development. I think they've all got to have the same rigour applied to them at a point when they do become developed. But some of those are in very early development stages.
And if this will be shared with private sector businesses or algorithm designers, is this something that you might address in your biometric strategy?
In terms of sharing with the private sector, I mean, I think it is quite important that we work with the private sector to understand what might be possible, but also possible within the realms of legality. So through the Criminal Finances Bill, we talked there about government and the private sector, particularly banks, working together in order to uncover serious and organised crime through a collaboration between public and private.
Okay, thank you.
The Biometrics Commissioner made an interesting point. I just quote from the report: the use by the police and other biometrics may well be in the public interest and may improve public safety, but the points made above in respect to facial images equally apply. Indeed, the lack of clarity about future governance arrangements for new biometrics may actually impede such growth. So in other words, if you don't have the sort of reassurance in place and a clear legal framework that everybody signs up to, then because you don't have public confidence, then you don't gain the advances or you're not able to exploit this technology in the right sense of the word, as we may be able to if we have that framework in place. Does that make sense to you?
Well, certainly I think it goes to a lot of what we've been talking about this morning, and certainly goes to my ambition to set up oversight, an oversight board. But I think that the possibilities are really exciting, but I also think there should always be safeguards in place to ensure that any privacy issues and ethical issues are very robustly considered.
Okay. Darren?
Very briefly on that, Chair. Dr. They said in the previous session that she had concerns about the pricing models when working with private companies for forensic labs, for example, and one's gone bust already, and she said there might be concerns with others where they have competed based on pricing that isn't probably sufficient, at least for the most complicated requirements. Do you share that view in the traditional forensics space? And also, if you do, would you take that forward to then these new areas of biometric private-public partnerships?
Well, I think there are many forensic services providers, and this is the first one that's gone bust. Obviously, there was a Randox situation last year, but that was an entirely different matter. There are plenty of forensics providers that are perfectly viable, but I think it's important that the police in their procurement take into account what market viability looks like.
So it's a question for the local police forces, not for
Well,
government.
the police are the ones who procure the services.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
And I will write to you on the points that you wanted further clarification.
Yes, actually, just one of the points that you're going to write on is the number of applications and the number of denials where there's an innocent person who thinks their image may have been restored. I mean, just the final question on that: would presumably we would assume, because it's only this exceptional circumstances, that when an application is made, there would only be a small proportion that got turned down, where there's an innocent person.
I can't. Well, I would assume that, but I can't give you that.
That would be your assumption based on the exceptional circumstances test that you apply.